80295. The Scottish Government is to launch a legal challenge to Westminster's bloc on its controversial gender reforms. The proposals, which would allow people in Scotland to self-identify their sex, were passed by the Scottish Parliament in December last year, but they were blocked by the UK government over their potential impact on UK-wide equality laws. Our political correspondent, Lindsay Bewes, is with me. Lindsay, just, lots of people are interested in this, and just for background, what's the background here?
Yeah, sure, John. Well, the Scottish Government had said that these reforms were needed because the current process of gender recognition that operates across the UK is too invasive and too difficult. And among the changes they were bringing in with this new system was removing the need for any medical reports. Now, critics said that that could make the system more open to abuse, and they highlighted concerns about protection for single-sex spaces as well. The legislation, after it was passed at Holyrood at the end of last year, was then, in an unprecedented move, blocked by the Scottish Secretary Alistair Jack using what's known as a Section 35 order. It had never been used before. He said that was because there would be an adverse impact on British equality laws. Now, the onus was then on whether the Scottish Government would challenge that in the courts by way of a judicial review. And today we got confirmation that they intend to do so. The Social Justice Secretary, Shirley Ann Somerville, had said that their offers to work with the government on potential changes to the legislation had been refused outright by Alistair Jack. So she said legal challenge was the only reasonable means of resolving the situation. She said it was also important to have clarity on the interpretation and scope of that Section 35 power and its impact on devolution, and that it should now be legally tested in the courts.
Given the Scottish Government has decided to mount a legal challenge, what do you think the political implications are?
Yeah, well, Hamzas Yousaf, as the new First Minister, has stressed the bill was backed by a majority of MSPs and has said that a legal challenge is the right thing to do. But there are those on his own benches who have concerns about the bill and don't support this legal action. And that includes his leadership rivals, Kate Forbes, who said her starting point would be to look at trying to make some changes to the legislation. And Ash Regan, who quit as a minister over this legislation, said she wouldn't challenge it because it was a case that she said she believed the Scottish Government would lose in the courts. Now, the Greens, they have said that they support this legal challenge. Hamzas Yousaf has maintained the Butte House agreement with the Greens. And I think that this legal action would have been a big part of that had he not gone to court. I'm not sure that the Greens would have stuck around in that particular arrangement. However, there is some polling that suggests the public don't see this as a priority. So I think the risk for Hamzas Yousaf is that he will expend political capital on this issue when there's lots of other things for him to be addressing, including reuniting his own party after that bruising leadership contest, dealing with the internal turmoil the SNP is facing, and not least as well the big challenges facing government around the NHS and cost of living.
Well, it has been argued this is a great diversion then, isn't it? So what's the reaction to this?
Yeah, this was a politically divisive piece of legislation, let's face it, and unsurprisingly, this court action is proving divisive along pretty much the same lines. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has defended the UK government's decision. He has said, obviously, there's a court process and we will follow that through. Alistair Jack, who took this action, said the government in the UK will robustly defend its decision. Maggie Chapman of the Scottish Greens said it was shocking that the parties here had been put in this position, and she said we cannot allow the rights and lives of trans people to be used as a political pawn in Westminster's reactionary culture war. Scottish Labour's reaction has been interesting. They supported the reforms, but today their equalities spokesman Paul O'Kane said that trans people and women are still being failed, and the SNP and Tory governments are doing nothing to find consensus. They said a fraught and expensive legal battle could have been avoided. So it doesn't sound like Scottish Labour necessarily supports this move to go to court.
Lindsay, thank you very much indeed. Listening to that, Susan Smith, a member of the For Women Scotland group, and you've been campaigning, Susan, against the government's gender reform proposals. Hello to you.
Hello, thank you.
Pleasure. Your reaction to the news, I mean, this wasn't exactly unexpected, was it?
No, it wasn't. I mean, it was a bit of a plank of Hamzas Yousaf's campaign. But one thing that rather bruising leadership election campaign did show is how split the SNP is on this, that there is a lot of distaste for this within the party. And it was arguably a factor in some of the troubles that Nicola Sturgeon had towards the end of her tenure, especially with the news around Isla Bryce and Adam Graham, the rapist who was put in a women's prison, which just really served to highlight some of the dangers that self-ID can introduce. Most legal opinion is that Hamza Yusuf will lose this. So it seems that he's pressing ahead in the face of misgivings in his own party and in some cases outright hostility in his own party to appease the Greens.
You're kind of talking politics now because we've interviewed a lawyer who doesn't believe that at all. We'll run that later. But in terms of how this should work out, shouldn't you be happy to some degree? You didn't like the legislation, so now just let the courts decide.
Yeah, I mean, we're quite happy to let the courts decide because we think the courts will agree with the HRC, who, after all, are the experts on this, that this does impact on the Equality Act.
They've got to prove that it impacts on the Equality Act in a negative manner, which, according to some lawyers, will be quite difficult to prove. Very difficult to prove.
Well, I think, I mean, I don't know which lawyers you've spoken to, but obviously people like Lord Hope, who are incredibly senior lawyers, would say that it does. And as I say, the EHRC, that's the statutory body that's set up to oversee the operation of the Equality Act, believe that it does have an impact. And the simple fact of the matter is, sex is a protected characteristic in the Equality Act. And what the Scottish Government are attempting to do is to change the definition of sex on one side of the border. And of course, that is going to then have an impact on the operation of the Act across the whole of the UK. It couldn't possibly be otherwise.
I mean, isn't this just about making it easier for trans people, though? I think 20 countries around the world have this. Countries like Argentina, Belgium, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Ireland, New Zealand, Norway, Portugal, Spain, among the 20 countries who already have this.
Yes, and many of them have had enormous problems. Many of them have a pretty terrible record on women's human rights. I mean, you cited Argentina. Well, abortion's only just been legalized in Argentina, but we were seeing women in prison being impregnated by male prisoners who are claiming to have a female gender identity. We've had sex offenders in prisons in Ireland. The situation in some of the US states and in Canada has been horrific for women. And we've had a woman accused of a hate crime in Norway because she objected to the presence of a fully intact man in the changing rooms in the gym. So it's a nonsense and a myth to say there have been no issues in these countries.
I didn't say there have been no issues, but even if you disagree with the aims of the legislation here, surely you can appreciate the principle at stake, which is the Scottish Government would argue it would undermine the existence of the Scottish Parliament should they not be allowed to do this.
Well, no, because the Scottish Parliament is set up as a devolved body. It's not set up as an independent parliament. Now, obviously, that's a different political issue, and some people would like for Scotland to become independent, and some people are opposed to that. But at the moment, we have this system, and within that system, we have an acknowledgement that some matters are reserved and some matters are devolved. And Section 35 is part of that settlement, and it exists to ensure that the Scottish Government cannot overstep its competence, which is what it's done. And it's a very rare occurrence, which shows how well, in a way, ironically, this has all worked up until now. But I really don't think the Scottish Government want to go down a route where they are having to ask Westminster's permission before they put a bill to the chamber, which seems to be the rather odd situation they seem to be suggesting with this. They're saying Westminster didn't tell us that they couldn't do it. That's simply not true. They were told that they would have to sort out the legal issues around this crossover before they introduced this bill, and they didn't. So they walked into this knowing what they were getting into.
Thank you for your time. Before you go, do you believe that trans women are women?
No, not in the sense that they are not biologically women. There are two sexes. This is we're talking about sex here. There are two sexes, there are male and female, and the law, the Equality Act that we're talking about, is set up to represent the fact that there are different issues and different situations where sex is important and needs to be protected. And people get into this terribly torturous argument about frankly, about feelings. And what we need to get back to is facts and science.
Thank you for making yourself clear. Thank you, Susan Smith for Women's Scotland Group. Texter, welcome.